Arthur Finch measured his days in pipe diameters and water pressure. His world was the subterranean network of the city's veins and arteries, a place of concrete, iron, and a constant, rushing dark. For 20 years, he had worked for the municipal sanitation department, a quiet man in a gray uniform, his face etched with a permanent sort of resignation. His colleagues knew him as methodical, reliable, and distant. They didn't know that the silence he carried was heavy with the ghost of a small boy, his son, Liam, taken by a fever a decade ago, leaving a void in Arthur's life that no amount of routine could ever fill. The grief was a low hum beneath the surface of his orderly existence, a constant companion in the quiet cab of his truck and the echoing depths of the city's underbelly. One Tuesday, under a sky the color of dishwater, he was running a camera sled through a main sewer line beneath a newly developed commercial plaza. On the screen in his van, the familiar monochrome tunnel spooled out, a silent film of grime and flowing water. He was looking for cracks, blockages, the usual culprits of urban decay. The area had once been the sprawling parking lot of a budget supermarket, a place he vaguely remembered from the news 4 years ago. A boy had vanished from there, Leo Kenway, 7 years old. 1 minute he was helping his mother load groceries, the next he was gone. The case had saturated the local media for months. The tearful pleas from his mother, the grim-faced police chief, the slow, agonizing fade from headline to cold case file. Arthur's finger hovered over the joystick controlling the camera. Something was caught in a narrow junction, a lateral pipe feeding into the main conduit. It wasn't the usual detritus of a plastic bottle or a sodden clump of rags. It was small, pale, and oddly clean. He maneuvered the camera closer, the lens cutting through the murky water. The image sharpened, resolving into a familiar shape. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. It was a bird. A small, carved wooden bird, its wings slightly upturned as if in mid-flight. It was identical to one he had carved for Liam on his 6th birthday, a simple whittling project from a piece of soft pine. His own hands had shaped that exact curve of the wing, that same simple notch for the beak. His heart began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. The bird was lodged but not waterlogged. It looked anew. Couldn't have been tumbling through the city's digestive tract for 4 years. It would have been worn smooth, stained black. This one looked like it had been dropped yesterday. A memory surfaced, an old news report, a detail he had forgotten. Leo's mother had mentioned her son's favorite toy, a wooden bird his grandfather had made him. The sight of the bird in that dark, forgotten place triggered something deep within Arthur. It was more than just a coincidence. It felt like a violation. That simple object, so full of personal meaning for him, was now tangled up in the memory of another lost boy. He felt a cold knot of certainty form in his gut. This meant something. He didn't know what, but he knew he couldn't leave it there. He marked the coordinates, reeled in the camera sled, and spent the rest of the afternoon orchestrating the retrieval. He told his supervisor it was a potential blockage that needed to be cleared manually. He didn't mention the bird. That evening, he sat at his small kitchen table, the wooden bird resting on a clean paper towel. He had scrubbed it gently with a soft brush, and now it looked almost pristine. He turned it over and over in his calloused fingers. The weight of it was both familiar and alien. This wasn't just a lost toy. The location was too specific, the condition too unlikely. The sewer line ran directly beneath the very spot where Leo Kenway's life had been so violently interrupted. Why would it appear now, for years later? His mind, usually occupied with flow rates and pressure gradients, began to churn with questions. It felt less like a piece of evidence and more like a message, a whisper from a place no one had thought to look. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he opened his old laptop and began to search. He read through the old articles, his screen glowing in the dim apartment. He saw the grainy photos of Leo, a gap-toothed smile under a mess of brown hair. He read the words of his mother, Clara Kenway, her quotes vibrating with a pain that felt raw even through the filter of time and text. He found the name of the lead detective, a man named Miller, who had since retired. He felt a strange and powerful pull, a sense of duty that was tangled up with his own unresolved sorrow. He had been powerless to save Liam. But this felt different. This felt like a second chance. Not to fix his own past, but to mend a piece of someone else's shattered present. The next day at work, he found his coworker, Frank, by the coffee machine. Frank was a big, jovial man, the closest thing Arthur had to a friend. Arthur pulled the small bird from his pocket and placed it on the counter. He explained where he had found it, the connection to the Kenway case, the feeling in his gut that it was important. Frank picked up the bird, turned it over, and set it back down with a soft click. He looked at Arthur, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Art, it's a toy," he said, his voice gentle. "Kids lose things. Probably fell down a storm drain last week. Some other kid's toy." "It's the same kind of toy, Frank. And it was right under the spot." "It's a coincidence," Frank insisted, his brow furrowed. "Listen to me. This isn't your fight. That poor woman, the boy's mother. You're going to stir all that up again for nothing. You'll just get yourself hurt." He paused, his gaze softening. "You know what I mean. Don't go down that road again, pal. It's not healthy." Frank's words were meant to be kind, a shield against the pain he saw waiting for Arthur. But they landed like stones. Don't get hurt again. He was right. Digging into the disappearance of a child was like pressing on the tender, bruised tissue of his own loss. It was safer to remain numb, to stick to pipes and pressures, to the predictable dark. For a moment, Arthur considered it. He could put the bird in a drawer, forget he ever saw it, and let the ghost of Leo Kenway rest. But then he pictured the bird again, pale and solitary in the rushing filth of the sewer, a tiny, defiant beacon. It was a symbol of something lost and abandoned, and he couldn't bring himself to abandon it, too. Frank saw the decision in his eyes. "Just be careful, Art," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Be careful." Arthur pocketed the bird. He knew Frank was right about the risks, but the feeling in his gut was stronger than his fear. He felt a profound sense of responsibility, and a logical conviction that this small piece of wood had found its way to his camera for a reason. His grief for Liam had hollowed him out, but now, for the first time in years, something was beginning to fill that empty space. It was not hope, not yet. It was a grim and unfamiliar sense of purpose. He was going to see this through. Frank's warning echoed in his mind, a voice of sensible caution he chose to ignore. The image of the bird, clean and solitary in the oppressive dark of the sewer, had imprinted itself on his thoughts. It was a loose thread, and his methodical nature, the very trait that made him a good sanitation worker, compelled him to pull on it. He couldn't go to the police. What would he say? That he had a hunch about a 4-year-old cold case based on a wooden toy? They would dismiss him as a crank, another grieving soul projecting his own tragedy onto the world. He needed something more tangible. His research had given him a name, Gerald Fleming. He was the security guard on duty at the supermarket the night Leo vanished. According to the old reports, his testimony had been unremarkable. He had seen nothing, heard nothing. He'd done his rounds, helped a few customers, and only learned of the missing boy when his frantic mother had run back into the store. A few months after the incident, Fleming had quit his job. Arthur found a public records database and, with a few clicks, discovered that a Gerald Fleming of the right age now worked as a night janitor at Northwood Community College, just a few towns over. It was a thin lead, almost nothing, but it was the only lead he had. The next evening, Arthur drove to the college. The campus was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of sodium lamps. He found Fleming's car, a dented sedan, in the staff parking lot. He waited. An hour later, a man emerged from a side door, pushing a wheeled trash bin. He was older, with stooped shoulders and a shock of thinning white hair. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had long ago made peace with monotonous labor. Arthur got out of his car and approached him, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his chest. "Mr. Fleming?" Arthur asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent night. The man stopped and turned, his face a mask of mild curiosity. "That's me. Can I help you?" He had a soft, almost grandfatherly voice. My name is Arthur Finch. I wanted to ask you about something that happened a few years ago, at the old Value Mart supermarket. The night Leo Kenway disappeared. Fleming's friendly expression didn't change, but a subtle tension entered his posture. He leaned against his trash bin. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice still soft, but with a new, guarded edge. A terrible tragedy. I told the police everything I knew. I'm sure you did, Arthur said, trying to keep his tone neutral. I work for the city. We were doing some work on the sewer lines under the old lot. We found something. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden bird, holding it in his open palm under the lamplight. We found this. For a single unguarded second, Fleming's eyes darted to the bird, and his face went slack with something that looked like pure, unadulterated shock. It was a flicker, a momentary glitch in his placid facade, but Arthur saw it clearly. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. Fleming chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. It's a little toy bird, he said, shrugging. Kids lose things all the time. I'm not sure what that has to do with me. Leo Kenway had one just like it, Arthur pressed gently. It was his favorite toy. Is that so? Fleming's voice was now unervingly calm. He pushed himself off the bin. Well, like I said, it was a tragedy. But a lost toy doesn't change anything. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He began to push the bin toward a dumpster, his back now to Arthur. His dismissal was too complete, his composure too absolute. It wasn't the reaction of a man with nothing to hide. It was the reaction of a man slamming a door shut. Arthur drove home, Fleming's feigned indifference replaying in his mind. The flicker of shock he had seen in the man's eyes was all the confirmation he needed. Fleming knew about the bird. He was connected. The quiet janitor with the grandfatherly voice was a liar. A cold certainty settled over Arthur. He was no longer just pulling on a loose thread. He was now convinced that thread was attached to something monstrous. He couldn't let it go. The image of Gerald Fleming's face, that brief, unguarded flash of fear, was burned into his memory. Arthur started watching him. It was a clumsy, amateurish surveillance, conducted from the driver's seat of his aging pickup truck. He would park across the street from the community college in the evenings, watching Fleming arrive for his shift. He'd follow him home in the early hours of the morning, watching the janitor's sedan pull into the driveway of a modest suburban house. For 2 weeks, the routine was unchanging, mind-numbingly dull. Arthur began to doubt himself, to hear Frank's cautionary words in his head. Maybe he had imagined that look in Fleming's eyes. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, the routine broke. Fleming didn't go to the grocery store or the hardware store. Instead, he drove to a self-storage facility on the industrial edge of town. It was a sprawling, anonymous place, a grid of corrugated steel doors under a vast, empty sky. Arthur watched from a distance as Fleming keyed in a code at the gate, drove his sedan inside, and disappeared around a corner. Arthur's pulse quickened. What did a quiet janitor need a storage unit for? He waited. Nearly an hour passed before Fleming's car reemerged and drove away. The visit was too long, too deliberate for simply dropping off a box of old winter clothes. Fleming did it again the following Saturday. The storage unit was a part of his secret life. Arthur knew he had reached the limit of what he could do alone. He was a sanitation worker, not a detective. He was trespassing on dangerous ground, armed with nothing but a gut feeling and a wooden bird. He needed an ally, not a skeptic. He needed someone for whom this was more than just a morbid curiosity. He needed Clara Kenway. Finding her was easy. Her name was still in the phone book, a testament to a life frozen in time. Driving to her small, tidy house was one of the hardest things Arthur had ever done. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes, the wooden bird feeling heavy as lead in his pocket. He was about to walk up to a grieving mother's door and offer her a sliver of what was likely to be false hope, potentially reopening a wound that had never truly healed. His own grief screamed at him to turn back, to leave this poor woman in peace. But the image of the storage unit of Fleming's secret visits pushed him forward. He knocked. The woman who answered the door was slighter than he had imagined from her pictures. Her face etched with a permanent, weary sadness. Her eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent. "Mr. Finch," she said. He had called ahead, offering only that he had some information about the city's work near the old supermarket. It was a weak pretext, but it had worked. "Mrs. Kenway," he began, his voice rough. "Thank you for seeing me. This is going to sound strange." He told her everything, starting with the camera sled in the sewer. He spoke quietly, factually, laying out the sequence of events. The bird, his talk with Fleming, the unsettling denial, the weekly trips to the storage facility. He watched her face, saw the flicker of exhausted disbelief, the defense mechanism of a person who had endured 4 years of cranks and false leads. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Then, he took out the bird and held it out to her. "This is what I found." Clara Kenway stared at the object in his palm. Her composure, so carefully maintained, finally shattered. A choked sob escaped her lips, and she reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the curve of the wing as if it were a holy relic. "His Poppy gave him this?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "He carved it for him. Leo never went anywhere without it." She looked up at Arthur, her eyes shining with a desperate, terrifying light. "Fleming," she said, the name a venomous hiss. "Gerald Fleming. He was the security guard. He was so kind. He told me not to worry. He said little boys always wander off, that he'd be home before I knew it." The memory, once a small comfort, had curdled into something sinister. Her skepticism was gone, burned away by the sight of that impossible bird. In its place was a fierce, renewed determination. Arthur felt a profound sense of relief. He was no longer alone in this. "The storage unit," she said, her voice hardening. "We have to go there." They drove to the facility in Arthur's truck, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. They parked across the street, the rows of identical steel doors looking menacing in the late afternoon sun. They didn't know what they were looking for. They just knew they had to be there. An hour passed. Then, just as Arthur was beginning to think the day was a bust, Fleming's sedan pulled up to the gate. He keyed in his code and drove inside, turning down the lane that corresponded with the unit number Arthur had managed to glimpse on his last visit. B-17. Clara grabbed Arthur's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "What is he doing in there?" she breathed. They waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Arthur felt a growing unease. This was more than just storing old junk. This felt like a ritual. Then he saw it. It was small, easy to miss. Near the top of the roll-up door of Unit B-17, almost hidden in the deep groove of the corrugated metal, was a small, circular vent. From this distance, he couldn't be sure, but it looked like a small fan, the kind used for computer cooling. And it was spinning, a low, almost inaudible whirring. Arthur's blood ran cold. Why would a storage unit need ventilation? The horrifying implications struck him with the force of a physical blow. You don't ventilate a unit for boxes and old furniture. You ventilate it for something that's alive. A knot of ice and fire formed in his stomach. Leo! It was impossible, insane, but the thought was there, blazing in his mind. He could still be alive, trapped, inside that metal box. He turned to Clara, saw the same dawning horror reflected in her eyes. She had seen the fan, too. Her face was pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This was it, the point of no return. They were no longer investigating a memory. They were standing at the edge of an active crime scene. The danger was no longer a vague possibility. It was real, it was immediate, and it was whirring away just 100 yards in front of them, concealed behind a roll-up steel door. Clara's hand was already shaking as she reached for her phone. Her voice, when she spoke to the 911 operator, was miraculously steady, a blade of pure maternal will cutting through her terror. She gave their location, her name, and the name of her missing son, Leo Kenway. Arthur stood beside her, his gaze locked on Unit B-17, his mind racing. He relayed the crucial details to Clara, who passed them on to the dispatcher: the cold case, the security guard, the suspicious behavior, and finally, the most damning fact of all: the crude, whirring ventilation fan on the door of the storage unit. He urged her to stress the urgency, the possibility that someone was inside. That time was critical. The minutes that followed were the longest of Arthur's life. Every passing car on the nearby road sounded like salvation, then faded into disappointment. Finally, 2 police cruisers turned into the facility's entrance. Their movements swift and purposeful, no sirens, just a silent, deadly serious arrival. An officer, a woman with a grimly professional demeanor, approached them. Clara, her voice trembling but firm, explained the situation again. Arthur pointed toward Unit B-17. The officer looked, saw the fan, and her expression hardened. She spoke into her radio, her voice low and clipped. This was no longer a wild goose chase. The physical anomaly of the fan, connected to a person of interest in a famous cold case, was enough. A warrant was being expedited. More cars arrived, unmarked sedans carrying detectives. The scene transformed from a quiet vigil into a tense, operational staging ground. They kept Arthur and Clara back, a kindness that felt like a torment. All they could do was watch as the police, armed with bolt cutters the size of a man's leg, approached the door of B-17. The snap of the lock breaking was shockingly loud in the tense silence. 2 officers gripped the handle of the steel door and heaved it upward with a deafening rattle. The interior of the unit was unremarkable at first glance. It was filled with the mundane clutter of a life packed away. Dusty lawn furniture, stacks of yellowing newspapers, cardboard boxes sealed with cracking tape. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. For a heart-stopping moment, Arthur felt a wave of crushing disappointment. Had he been wrong? Had he dragged this poor woman through a new level of hell for nothing? But the detectives moved with purpose. They pushed aside a tall, rickety shelving unit. Behind it was a heavy canvas tarp tacked to a makeshift wooden frame. They tore it down. And behind that was a second wall, a false one, constructed of soundproofing panels and insulated foam. One of the detectives used a pry bar, and a section of the wall came away, revealing a dark opening. A faint, stale odor escaped, the smell of unwashed bodies and confinement. And from within that darkness, a small, pale face peered out, blinking in the sudden light. The face was thin, the eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. He was older, his features sharpened by years and hardship, but there was no mistaking him. Clara let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. Leo. It was Leo. He was alive. He was 11 years old, bone-thin and ghostly pale, but he was alive. As the officers helped him out, the full horror of the scene became clear. He was not alone. Huddled in the back of the small, squalid room were 2 other children. A little boy and a girl, both younger than Leo, both weeping silently. The cell was a nightmare of survival. A stained mattress on the floor, a plastic bucket in the corner, shelves stacked with canned food and bottles of water. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. This was never just about one lost boy. Fleming wasn't a lone kidnapper who had panicked. He was something far worse. This was organized. This was a holding cell. The depravity of it was deeper and colder than anything he could have possibly imagined. While paramedics rushed to the children, wrapping them in blankets and speaking in low, soothing tones, police units were already speeding toward Gerald Fleming's suburban home. They found him in his living room watching television. When they told him why they were there, his kindly grandfather persona held for a moment. He expressed confusion, then polite denial. But as they placed him in handcuffs, the mask finally cracked, and a torrent of rage and vitriolic curses erupted from him. The hidden monster was finally, violently, revealed. He and his accomplice, a woman who had posed as a social worker to gain access to the other 2 children, were in custody within the hour, their small, vile network collapsing under the weight of a single, impossible clue found in the dark. The world shifted from the harsh, sun-bleached reality of the storage facility to the sterile, fluorescent hum of a hospital. Arthur and Clara sat in a small, windowless waiting room, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the unreality of the day's events. Leo and the other two children were in a separate wing, being examined by doctors and child trauma specialists. The relief was so immense it was physically painful, a crushing weight on Arthur's chest. But it was tangled with the profound horror of what they had discovered. The truth was a poisoned chalice. Leo was alive, but he had lived through an unimaginable hell. A detective, the same woman who had first arrived on the scene, came to speak with them. Her name was Detective Harding. She sat down, her expression a mixture of professional exhaustion and human sympathy. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice low, "I need to be honest with you. Without your call, we never would have found them. We never would have even looked there. You saved their lives." Arthur could only nod, the words not fully registering. He felt less like a hero and more like an accidental witness to a cosmic horror. Later, they were taken to a police station for a formal debriefing. It was there that the fragments of Leo's story began to emerge, relayed through the careful filter of child psychologists. Fleming, whom Leo only ever knew as the janitor, had snatched him from the parking lot in a matter of seconds. He had told Leo a cruel, simple lie, that his mother didn't want him anymore, that she had driven away and left him. For 4 years, that lie had been Leo's reality. He was kept in the soundproofed room, a ghost in a metal box, his world defined by Fleming's intermittent visits with food and water. The other children had arrived more recently, snared by Fleming's accomplice. And then came the story of the bird. Leo had kept it hidden all those years, a secret talisman, his only link to the life he'd lost. In the floor of the storage unit, beneath a loose tile, was a small drain pipe. Leo had no idea where it led, but a few weeks ago, he had heard a faint, distant grinding sound from below. Arthur's camera slid on its routine inspection. Spurred by a desperate, childish hope, he had pushed his most prized possession into the pipe, praying it would go somewhere, anywhere, that someone might find it. It was an act of pure faith, a tiny message in a bottle cast into an ocean of filth and darkness. Harding also confirmed the sickening scope of Fleming's crimes. He and his partner were part of a small but vicious trafficking ring. They targeted vulnerable children, holding them in the storage unit until they could be sold. Fleming's confession, once he finally broke, was a chilling, remorseless account of his depravity. The kindly janitor was a facade, a carefully constructed mask he wore to move through the world unseen, his evil hidden in plain sight. The overwhelming evidence, the testimony of the children, and his own vile words sealed his fate. The case of Leo Kenway was officially closed. The monster had been caught. For Arthur, this confirmation was not a source of triumph, but of profound validation. His intuition, born from his own grief, had been right all along. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and quiet aftershocks. The city reeled from the news of the storage unit monster. But for Arthur, the noise of the outside world faded into the background. His life had been irrevocably altered. He returned to his job, to the familiar darkness of the sewers, but it looked different now. It was no longer just a network of pipes. It was a place where a miracle had begun, where a child's desperate prayer had been answered by his own lonely machine. Justice was set in motion. The legal system would do its work, and Fleming would disappear into a different kind of box, one from which he would never emerge. But Arthur knew, and Clara knew even more profoundly, that this was not a simple, happy ending. The rescue was just the beginning of a new and difficult journey. The trauma inflicted on Leo and the other children was a deep wound, a psychological scar that might never fully fade. Healing would be a slow, arduous process, measured in small victories and painful setbacks. There was no magic cure for 4 years of stolen childhood. A few months later, Arthur received an invitation to Clara Kenway's house. He went on a Sunday afternoon. The house felt different, lighter. The oppressive cloud of sorrow had not vanished, but it had thinned, allowing slivers of sunlight to break through. Clara greeted him at the door with a genuine, if tired, smile. And sitting on the living room floor, building a tower of blocks, was Leo. The boy was still quiet, still wary of the world, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in the hospital. He looked up as Arthur entered, and after a moment's hesitation, he walked over. He didn't speak. Instead, he held out his hand. In his small palm was a piece of wood, crudely carved into the shape of a dog. It was lopsided and unfinished, but it was brimming with intent. It was a gift. Arthur knelt down and accepted it, his throat tight with emotion. He looked from the small wooden dog to the boy who had survived the unimaginable. He saw the incredible, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. In that moment, his own decade-old grief for Liam felt different. It was still there, a permanent part of his emotional landscape, but it was no longer just a source of pain. It had been transformed into a catalyst, the very thing that had made him stop and look closer at a flicker on a screen. He hadn't been able to save his own son, but the love and sorrow he carried for him had, in a strange and winding way, allowed him to save someone else's. He held the small wooden dog in his hand, its rough edges a comfort against his skin. It was a symbol of a new beginning, born from the darkest of endings. He knew that the echoes of that metal box would linger for a long time, but here, in this quiet living room, was hope. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, fragile, and fiercely protected. It was the simple, profound courage to look down into the darkness and find the one small thing that had been left behind.